Hi everyone, welcome back to the Murder Tapes podcast, season 3, episode 4. I had family over this weekend, and I got to take my little brother to see the new Despicable Me. I am the biggest Despicable Me fan that there is, so it was a very important day for me. I've also been overworking myself this week, so I'm looking forward to the weekend because I really just want to go to Alamo Drafthouse and take my dog to the park. Aside from that, I hope you all have had a great weekend, and let's get into today's case. Today we're going to be talking about the Stephen Griffiths case, also known as the Bradford murders. Stephen Sean Griffiths was born on Christmas Eve, or December 24th of 1969 in Dewsbury, Yorkshire, to Moria Dewhurst, a telephonist, and Stephen Griffiths, a frozen food salesman. Even from a young age, he displayed a troubling fascination with violence. According to research from Bradford University, Stephen witnessed his mother engaging in sexual activities with multiple men in their backyard. Additionally, he exhibited disturbing behavior such as torturing and skinning birds. His mother would later be convicted of benefit fraud, and his parents split up when he was very young. His 61-year-old father, who was also named Stephen, hadn't seen him in over 10 years at the time of his arrest. His father saw a photograph of him and didn't recognize him while he was incarcerated. His mother was a receptionist when he was very young, and she saved £9,000 a year in order to send him to the Queen Elizabeth Grammar School. £9,000 would equate to $11,700 US. Of course, it would have been less since this was many years ago, though I'm not sure the exact year. But in case you were interested in the conversion today, that's what it would be. Interestingly enough, the acid bath serial killer, John George Hay, attended the same school and was awarded a scholarship in the early 20th century. John would beat and shoot his victims to death before using sulfuric acid to dispose of their bodies so that he could forge their signatures and sell their possessions. I will be doing a separate episode on this case. That case is believed to have made an impression on Stephen, according to David Wilson, a professor of criminology that examined the Bradford murders. By the time Stephen reached 18 years old, he had already developed a criminal record, regularly engaging in shoplifting. His criminal activities escalated when he slashed a supermarket manager with a knife during an incident, resulting in a 3-year prison sentence. In 1991, Stephen received a diagnosis of being a sadistic schizoid psychopath, as reported by The Telegraph. He reportedly expressed his belief that he would eventually become a killer. He even told his probation officer that he fantasized about serial killing. A psychiatric evaluation described his fixation on murder, particularly multiple homicides. The following year, in 1992, Stephen returned to prison after he threatened a girl with a knife, marking another dark chapter in his disturbing history. Stephen didn't possess any signs of psychotic illness or a treatable mental disorder, meaning that he cannot be sectioned under the Mental Health Act. Something random but interesting to note is that he would place cotton in his ears every night so that insects wouldn't enter. He also didn't work and lived solely on benefits and grants. In 1998, he began a 2-year relationship. When he finally invites his girlfriend to his place, she discovers that every surface, including the carpet, is covered in plastic. This unsettling sight raises her suspicions, prompting her to quickly make excuses and end the relationship soon afterward. Stephen then enters into an abusive relationship with another woman, from which she manages to escape in 2001. Despite her departure, he continues to harass her for years, vandalizing her home with graffiti and leaving menacing messages on her voicemail. In one chilling message, he laughs manically and says, "I'm not going to go away, so I guess you'd better." He then bought 2 lizards and walked them like they were dogs. One of his neighbors, named Rachel Farrington, agreed to go into his home to see his pets. She describes his place as a maze. Stephen demonstrates how he feeds live rats to his pets, and she witnesses a lizard biting one in half. Stephen would say, "That's nature for you." A former friend of Stephen would tell police he remembers seeing him eat a small live baby rat before washing it down with water. In the mid-2000s, Stephen decided to pursue an academic path reflecting his disturbing fascination with homicide. He got his degree in psychology and then enrolled in a graduate program in homicide studies at the University of Bradford, a choice that would soon take a chilling turn towards reality. According to The Guardian, Stephen adopted the online persona Vin Pariah and a, quote, misanthrope who brought hate into heaven, where he philosophized, quote, humanity is not just a biological condition, it is also a state of mind. On that basis, I am a pseudo-human being at best, a demon at worst. Stephen stood nude from the chest up in a photograph and referenced the Bible's Ezekiel 25:17, quote, the path of the righteous man is beset on all sides. When Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction featured the statement in a graphic execution scene, it became well known. In a post, he would say, quote, what will this pseudo-human do? One wonders. Poor Stephen pretended to be me, but he was only the wrapping. He knew towards the end that I supplied the inner core of iron. Hatred bound tightly in flesh. At very long last, the time has come to act out. I am the great red dragon. I am not a man. You are a privy to a great becoming, but you recognize nothing. To me, you are a slug in the sun. Before me, you rightly tremble. But fear is not what you owe me. You owe me all. This entry resonates with Thomas Harris's portrayal of a psychopath in Red Dragon, the renowned novel that introduces Hannibal Lecter. If you're not aware, Hannibal Lecter is a cannibalistic serial killer character that was once a respected forensic psychiatrist. Initially regarded as an oddity by neighbors in his Bradford apartment complex, Stephen attracted attention for his habit of walking pet lizards on leashes, his slicked back hair, sunglasses, and a long coat adding to his mysterious image. However, concerns escalated when Stephen displayed erratic behavior and reportedly became aggressive towards female residents of the building. Complaints prompted property managers to increase surveillance with enhanced CCTV coverage and gather information for police involvement. Discovery of Stephen's unsettling reading materials on human dismemberment by library staff, as reported by The Telegraph, further fueled apprehension among apartment personnel. Despite Stephen's documented history of violence and his fascination with serial killers, local law enforcement had previously confiscated weapons from him. Nonetheless, they failed to foresee the full extent to which Stephen would translate his disturbing interests into horrifying actions. Stephen's doctoral research focused on homicide in industrial areas, a chilling parallel to the crimes he was actively committing. His targets were women in Bradford's red light district. Stephen's first known victim was Susan Rushworth, a 43-year-old sex worker who vanished after disembarking from a bus in Bradford on June 22, 2009. She was a mother of 3 and struggled with addiction to drugs after a brain hemorrhage that caused epilepsy. She turned to sex work in order to fund her addiction. Little information surfaced about her disappearance, and her body has never been recovered. However, Susan's mom, Christine, would state that she was turning her life around and reduced her drug intake while living with her. The day she vanished, she told her mother that she was leaving to buy medicine. Nearly a year later, Stephen struck again. On April 26, 2010, Shelley Armitage disappeared after heading out to work, as reported by The Guardian. Shelley was a former student at St. Joseph's College and was known for being a popular and bubbly girl. There were holiday photos of her on the beach, and it was known that she wanted to be a model and travel the world. Her and her best friend started experimenting with drugs, and she became addicted. She too turned to sex work to fund this addiction. Reportedly, Stephen recorded the dismemberment of Shelley on his phone before disposing of her remains in a nearby river via public transit. Remarkably, he lost the phone shortly afterward, leaving it on a train. The footage discovered on the phone eventually reached the police. In the video, Stephen can be seen dragging her into his home and tying her up in a bathtub. In the video, you see the words, "My sex slave," in black paint on her back. He can be heard saying, quote, "I am the Vin Pariah. I am the bloodbath artist. Here's a model who is assisting me." After, he begins to dismember her with knives and power tools. Stephen then places her body parts into a large backpack and leaves to catch a train. He can be seen on camera at one of the train stations. Soon after, he disposes of the large backpack and returns home. When he arrives back home, he then disinfects every surface and tries to get rid of any evidence. In May 2010, Stephen targeted Suzanne Blamires as his next victim. There were photos of her during her teenage years, and she had dreamt of being a nurse. However, she started attending raves and taking recreational drugs. When she was 21 years old, she discovered heroin, and by 25, she was using sex work to pay for it. A few years before her death, two men named Jaroslav Balog and Jiri Sokal kicked her in the head and body multiple times. This resulted in multiple serious injuries. Suzanne was lured into his apartment by Stephen saying he was a photographer and was looking to pay women to lay on his bed with their backside in the air so that he could take pictures. He told them that they were going to be portraits in an art gallery. However, the photos were really for his own personal pleasure. Suzanne soon got up and ran down the hallway. She managed to momentarily escape Stephen's grasp during her abduction, but Stephen caught up with her, knocking her unconscious. He then retrieved his crossbow, returned to her, and fatally shot her in the head. As Stevens dragged Suzanne's lifeless body back to his apartment, he noticed a CCTV camera in the hallway, capturing the entire ordeal. Unbothered, Stevens defiantly gestured his middle finger toward the camera before continuing into his apartment. Later, the caretaker of Stevens' apartment complex was horrified upon reviewing the weekend's footage, witnessing the brutal scene. The caretaker promptly alerted the authorities, leading to Stevens' eventual apprehension. Stevens dismembered and disposed of Suzanne's remains between his final murder and eventual arrest. Shortly after, Stevens was said to have been composed and nearly emotionless when the police showed up at his residence to take him into custody. In police questioning, Stevens claimed to have killed loads more women than the 3 documented victims. When he initially appeared in court and was asked to identify himself, he replied, "The Crossbow Cannibal." He allegedly admitted to authorities that he had occasionally eaten and occasionally cooked pieces of his victims. The police determined that all of Griffiths' victims willingly entered his home, as evidenced by footage capturing Suzanne Blameyer's final moments. Heroin cost approximately 50 pounds per gram, while street prostitutes may charge as little as 20 pounds for their services. Griffiths preyed on their vulnerability due to addiction. To gain their trust, he posed as a photographer, promising drugs and money. He instructed them to pose provocatively, claiming it was for an art gallery, but instead photographed them post-mortem for his collection of trophies. An hour after he killed Suzanne, he searched for another victim. 28-year-old Rosalind Edmondson was heading to collect methadone from an all-night chemist not far from where he lived. At first, she walked with him, and he complimented her before inviting her into his place. Rosalind soon became weirded out and decided to go back to her own place. Stephen didn't try and convince her to change her mind, and he too went back home. I cannot imagine how she must feel after reading about what happened to all of his other victims, and how that could have been her. Professor of Criminology David Wilson was consulted to advise on the prosecution strategy if Stephen did not confess at trial. David suggested that Griffiths meticulously covered up evidence after his first kill and became increasingly bold by the third, likely because he understood the criteria for serial killers. 3 killings over time, indicating a deep knowledge of criminology during his student years. Quote, "There may be an element, although this is difficult to prove, that he is in a sense educating himself better about the phenomenon that he was going to engage in practically. Was he studying some of these books to understand how to avoid capture, how to dispose of bodies, how police would conduct an investigation?" David Wilson had access to the tapes in which Stephen taunted Kathy Hancock, his former girlfriend, that also had a child with him. I'm going to include audio of her speaking about Stephen.
Oh, it went on and on. At one point, he decided, because he had contact with lots of people in Bradford that I didn't know, and there was a gentleman that lived in the same block of flats. And so Stephen made an arrangement and drove with this person and his girlfriend in the car, and the plan was to shoot my parents. This guy knocks on my parents' door, my dad, and it's just pure fluke. My dad knew him from the prison. He was one of his inmates. And my dad's like, "What are you here for?" And he said, "Well, Stephen's actually sent me round to shoot you. And my dad said to her, and is that what you intend to do? And he was like, he went, you coming in then? Just stop. So they sat there in the front room, my mum, my dad, this guy and his girlfriend, and had a chat. Stephen apparently was round the corner in the car. Then my dad says, well, you're obviously not going to do anything, are you? And he said, no. Called him boss, no boss. They left, got in the car, and I don't know whether Stephen was annoyed or not.
Another thing that she remembers is him spiking her tea with a deadly drug. She recalls going to the hospital, and Stephen went to her home and got her dogs, but never stated what he did to them. She said the events left her broken and under his control. She would tell police that she had him arrested after he beat her. She wanted to leave, but found out that she was pregnant. She was scared of Stephen, and the fact that he would be the father. Stephen loved the idea of fatherhood, but she ended up losing the baby. Kathy would say, quote, he built a coffin for the pregnancy test. I made the conscious decision to keep in contact and not annoy him, because then I knew exactly where he was. Over time, Stephen would message her with aggressive texts, and Kathy finally cut all ties with him. David Wilson stated he believes Stephen is a misogynist with narcissistic personality disorder. Quote, he is somebody who is a wannabe. He is desperately keen for fame, even infamy. John George Hay attended his school, and Stevens and all the boys at the school were told of the link with the serial killer. David Wilson claimed that Stevens would constantly attempt to shift responsibility on his ex-partner, a tactic known as neutralization in psychology. He was usually in charge and spoke in a very forceful manner while discussing himself. Goodbye, Lizzie Borden, the story of the trial of America's most famous murderess and patterns of vengeance, cross-cultural homicide in the North American fur trade, were two of his favorite books from Amazon. David claimed that Stephen had obviously read his book, Hunting for Evil, which was about Steve Wright, and that Stephen had followed Wright's lead by submerging two of his victims in water to wipe out any traces of their DNA. Quote, I have never come across a case of a student of criminology wanting to become an offender, although there are unique aspects of this case. He also targeted groups of vulnerable women, similar to Wright, Sutcliffe, and Jack the Ripper. David believed that, like other serial killers, Stephen believed he could manipulate the media's attention. Stephen's every action seemed deliberate. Following his arrest, he selected the Bradford law firm Lum & McGill for representation, known for their involvement in cases like the Yorkshire Ripper. Those present at Stephen's initial appearance at Bradford Magistrates Court, including journalists and relatives, were struck by his behavior. When asked his name, he casually replied, "The Crossbow Cannibal," shocking the victims' families and prompting officials to question his statement. During a brief hearing at the Crown Court later that day, little opportunity arose for further disruption when asked if he was Stephen Sean Griffiths. "I am," he confirmed. A prostitute who had known Stevens for years expressed disbelief that he could be the same man. She described him as a caring individual who had supported her like family, providing food, washing clothes, and offering shelter when she had nowhere else to go, a far cry from the notorious label Crossbow Cannibal. Stephen was briefly considered a suspect in the unresolved 2001 murder and dumping of 19-year-old Rebecca Hall in an alleyway. However, no conclusive evidence was discovered, and Stephen remained silent. On December 21, 2010, Stephen entered a guilty plea and was found guilty of killing Suzanne Blamires, Shelley Armitage, and Susan Rushworth. According to the BBC, the judge in his case said, "I have no doubt the defendant should be kept in prison for the rest of his life because the circumstances of these murders are so wicked and monstrous." Stephen received a life sentence, and he is still incarcerated with no chance of release. Nevertheless, it did little to alleviate the anguish he had inflicted on his victims' families. He consistently refuses to speak with his legal team and has attempted suicide several times while in prison. He has also refused food on multiple occasions. Stephen has done so in hopes of being moved to the secure Rampton Psychiatric Hospital in Nottinghamshire due to the harsh reality of waking Wakefield prison. To give you an idea of this terrifying facility, it has been labeled as the Monster Mansion, where Ian Huntley, also known as the Soham Killer, was once held. Ian murdered two 10-year-old girls named Holly Marie Wells and Jessica Amy Chapman. I'll also be covering this case in another episode. Watching the CCTV footage is very chilling and unreal to look at. To think about the horror that these women faced and how their families feel is so heartbreaking. It's also scary that he was a graduate student studying murderers. That kind of reminded me of the Idaho murders because the perpetrator, Brian Koberger, was a teacher's assistant for a criminology course. I will be covering it very soon. As always, all evidence will be linked in the show notes as well as on our Instagram at Murder Tapes Podcast. Feel free to also follow my personal at Annalisa. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you on the next one.